Hello students, welcome to the New York School of Design Sewing Basics course. My name is Hannah Noth and I'm going to be your instructor throughout these next 10 videos. Today's video will be focused on the basics. Yeah, we're going to start at the very beginning, including turning your sewing machine on, like I mentioned, and threading your machine, both the top thread and the bobbin thread, which is the bottom thread of the machine. And we get to sew a couple basic seams today. When you go to thread your machine for the first time, you want to start with your bobbin. This is what a bobbin looks like. It's essentially a short spool. Always thread your bobbin first before you thread the rest of your machine. This is so important because your bobbin pulls thread from the same part of the machine the top of your machine pulls thread from. And when you thread your bobbin, you would have to unwind your work of the top part of the machine, thread your bobbin, insert your bobbin, and rethread the top part of the machine if it were already threaded when you were threading your bobbin. So essentially, do your bobbin first, and then you can thread the rest of your machine. Now, I was saying thread your bobbin. The correct term is winding your bobbin. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to wind our bobbins. That means threading your bobbin. Winding is another term for it. So let's get going. We're going to take our primary spool of thread and we're going to place it on the top spigot of your machine, right up here. You're going to take the end of the thread from the top spool of your machine and you're going to wind it around one tension point in between your spool of thread and the bobbin. In the case of my machine, I'm following the arrows. It's the simple tension plate right here. I'm just weaving the thread through it. Then I'm going to take the thread and I'm going to give the machine a little head start in bobbin winding. This is one of my favorite sewing tricks. I'm going to manually wind the thread around the bobbin just a couple times to get it started. Then I place the bobbin onto the shorter spigot that's close to the spool of thread, but not the same one. Now there's one more step to do in order to trigger bobbin winding, because right now your sewing machine thinks that you are sewing a normal seam, when in reality we want to wind the bobbin. So you need to find what will trigger bobbin winding for your machine. Most likely it will be a button or a lever. In the case of my machine, all I need to do is move the spigot over that the bobbin is on from left to right. That triggers bobbin winding. Now I'm ready to start winding my bobbin. In order to make sure that my machine winds the actual bobbin and not below or above it on the spigot, I want to start out very slowly with bobbin winding. So I'm going to lightly press my foot down on the foot pedal, similar to if you were driving a car and you wanted to go really slowly, only lightly press down on the gas pedal. In this case, the foot pedal. So very lightly, I'm going to press down on my foot pedal. There, making sure that the thread sticks to get it started. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to wind the bobbin the whole way. I'm going to stop there with plenty of thread on it for a project. However, feel free, especially if it's a neutral color thread, to go ahead and wind your whole bobbin. You won't be able to overfill it because your machine will automatically stop when it's all full. So I'm going to de-trigger bobbin winding by moving my spigot over. I'm going to take my bobbin off and I'm going to use a pair of small thread scissors like these and cut my thread. Like I said, the bobbin goes in the bottom. In order to access the bottom case on this machine, I actually remove this storage compartment, comes off totally, and I open this door. Inside here, I find the bobbin case cover. This is my bobbin case cover, and this is what I will be dropping my bobbin into. Let me call out just a small note that your machine may or may not have a bobbin case cover. Your machine may simply have you drop your bobbin without a case into your machine. It just depends on what type of brand you have. So no worries if you do not have a bobbin case cover. However, on my machine and a lot of machines, we still have a bobbin case cover. So I take the case and I drop my bobbin into it. Then I take the tail end of thread and I feed it through this large rectangular opening in the bobbin case, seeing that it pulls through easily. Next, I'm going to take my bobbin case and insert it into my machine, listening for a small click. I'm also going to hold this little lever on it out just a bit. Click. Okay, then I leave this thread loose, but I tuck it in just a little bit into the compartment and shut the door. I'm going to place the case compartment storage back on the machine, and for a moment we can forget about the bobbin and focus on threading the top part of the machine. So in order to thread the top part, let's look back at your spool of thread, because this is what we will be using to thread the top of the machine. And once again, you're going to follow your own machine specific instructions. Your machine will have diagrams, arrows, numbers, words, maybe a combination of all of those in order to help guide you as to how to thread your machine. But take note, you will always thread your machine from right to left and then down to the needle. The needle is where your thread will always end. So let's start at the beginning. Taking thread from the spool of thread, I'm going to feed it through and follow the numbers and arrows on my machine. There's 1, down to 2, back to 3. In the case of my machine, I actually have to turn my flywheel a slight bit for the lever that's on number 3 to pop up. Then I feed my thread through, of course, right to left, and down to where the needle is. There's a lever directly above my needle that's unmarked. You want to make sure you still place your thread through it. This will help ensure that your needle does not come unthreaded as easily while sewing. Then it's time to thread your needle. I'm going to thread from front to back, never back to front. Pull the end tail of your thread through so you have a nice long tail after threading your needle. Never leave just a little bit or cut your thread too short and close to the needle. Why? Because your machine could come unthreaded very quickly if you do that. And it's never fun to stop in the middle of a sewing project and have to rethread your machine. So I pulled a nice tail of thread through. Then I'm going to place the thread under this contraption. This is your presser foot. Presser foots are very important because they hold your fabric in place as you sew. You can never sew with your presser foot up. It always has to be in a down position. I'm going to feed my thread under and slightly behind the presser foot. So now my top thread is between my presser foot and the silver plate where my needles go. Then I'll take the needle and I'm going to move it down and up one full rotation using the flywheel in order to catch the bobbin thread. So take your flywheel and turn it towards you one 360-degree rotation. Watch very closely. There's a tiny loop of thread that just popped up from the bottom of the machine. That's my bobbin thread. That indicates that the bobbin was threaded correctly. So now I will use scissors or pliers to pull that bobbin thread out. And now I have 2 long tails of thread hanging out from my machine. This means that your machine is fully threaded and it's ready to be sewn with. Alright, so let's start by sewing your first seam. Take a scrap piece of fabric. I recommend something simple and woven like muslin. And you're going to place it underneath your presser foot. Make sure that your fabric is not only underneath your presser foot, but it's underneath your needle and slightly behind it. You don't ever want to start sewing with your muslin or your fabric in front of your needle. This could lead to your machine beginning to sew without any fabric and leading to a big thread tangle. So always have your fabric behind and always have your fabric underneath and a little behind your needle. Now it's time for us to place our presser foot down, because remember, you can't ever sew with your presser foot up. So feel around for a large lever that will indicate that it moves your presser foot up and down. Mine is on the top back right of this side of the machine. I move the lever down and the presser foot goes down. I move the lever back up and the presser foot goes up. It will become a form of habit for you in no time at all to always place your presser foot down before you sew and up when you're finished sewing. So let's place our presser foot down. We've already checked and made sure that we have the correct stitch type, length, and width selected. So now we're ready to sew our first seam. Once again, lightly press down on your foot pedal. Have two hands on your fabric at all times and slowly begin to sew. All right, that wraps up sewing video 1. Today we learned how to turn on our sewing machines, thread them, and get them going on some really basic seams. I hope you learned a lot. Join me for the next video, where we're going to learn the preparation work that goes into getting your fabric ready to sew, including ironing, cutting, and transferring markings from a pattern to the fabric. We're also going to work on sewing some straight seams. I'll see you then.